Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to yet another episode of Strange Playground. It's been a weird period for everyone, I think. I think that's fair enough to say. We're living through some very peculiar narratives right now. In fact, the narrative has yet to occur. We're living through the actual circumstance. It's going to be very interesting to see how we collectively and individually spin this narrative from these circumstances. What is going to be the narrative going forward from 2020? I think 2020 is certainly going to stand as a turning point. Very much as 2008 once did. I think there's going to be referring back to 2020 from this moment on as a point at which things either went one way or went the other, and it's hard to really see or predict where that way is going to be at the moment. And even given that, it's even more difficult to predict what the narratives are going to be. It's so difficult at the moment because the well is so polluted. The well is so polluted. We have this rather hideous notion within our cultures, which has been deliberately propagated, that every narrative is equally worthy, which it's not. It's absolutely not. That narratives of bigotry and tribalism are as legitimate and worthy as those of anti-bigotry or of acceptance and of celebration of what is different and strange and deviant in humanity, which they're not. They're simply not. It's fair. I mean, I think it's fair enough to say you'll know exactly what side of that particular divide I come down on. And quite frankly, you know what? Pick a side. That's what I can see from the narratives as they currently stand. Pick a fucking side. If you don't pick a side, you are immediately and automatically on the side of the right, I'm afraid to say, simply because the right-wing narratives are just so pervasive. They're not new right-wing narratives either, even though they do try to market themselves as such. They've been pervasive in our traditions forever, really, because unfortunately our cultures largely arise out of right-wing biases, out of what we would call right-wing now, and out of conditions that are inherently right-wing. So we've always had an uphill struggle. Those of us who come at things from a slightly ulterior perspective, as it were, who want to foster something a bit different and a bit new. I mean, I find it difficult because I often find even the narratives that the left try to push, which I have far more sympathy with, definitely too peaky, and I find them too small. I don't think they have enough. I don't think there's enough in them, you know? We need to start looking, it seems to me, at some utopian narratives. We really need to start looking at fostering genuine renaissance in our cultures. It needs to be huge. It needs to be vastly sweeping, and it needs to change us on a fundamental level to have any kind of lasting impact. Otherwise, all you're going to get is the same sad, tired rounds. It's going to be, which we're seeing now. Of course, we're seeing with the US election. We're seeing people are celebrating it as though it's some sort of return of the left, and that's really bizarre to me because the Democrats are not a left-wing party. The guy who is going to be the US president is about as left-wing. He's not left-wing. He is not. He has no left-wing principles at all. None whatsoever. So sadly, I mean, it's wearying. It's really wearying. But we find ourselves in a position where we're just constantly having to fight. We're constantly having to broach the ulterior narratives out there. And one of the best ways we can do that, obviously, is through fiction and through media, because that's what people actually take on board. It seems to me, I mean, maybe this is my bias coming through, because this is how I determine my own ideological positions and perspectives and whatnot. But fiction and media seem to be far more influential than just sitting here talking at people or ranting at people, or even providing a more specific ideological tract or something like that. I find that stuff so dry. I find it very difficult to absorb. I find reading fiction helps me to foster ideas far more eloquently and far more intimately than reading straight books of philosophy or whatever. I mean, I have read them. Obviously, I have. You have to if you've ever been to university at all. You kind of have to because of the emphasis on critical theory, and critical theory is essentially it's the suite of enshrined. It's the suite of enshrined. It's the suite of enshrined or academically prescribed theories through which you can uh, determine different interpretations and significances of texts or media. So the stuff like structuralism, post-structuralism, psychoanalytic theory, Marxist theory, and postmodern theory, and so on and so forth. So you have to read that stuff. I mean, some philosophical texts are beautiful. I mean, most of the stuff written by Marx is amazing. It really is. Not only in terms of its ideas, its prescience, but also the beauty of its writing. I mean, the problem with Marx is that he's so flowery. He rarely states anything in an absolute way. You have to understand a lot of idioms and a lot of cultural touchstones, a lot of stuff about Russian folklore and stuff like that in order to understand or even begin to understand what Marx is talking about. And that's kind of the fun of him, I find. I find that's the fun of Marx. That's the intrigue of Marx. I mean, I've read, I really love Dante's Inferno. I really love Dante's Inferno. And you need a good interpretation and you need a book that's got really good notes to understand Dante's Inferno, because of course it's from a culture that's long dead. It's from a language that that has moved on significantly since it was originally written. So to understand it at all, you need really good notes and contexts to really understand what Dante is actually referring to. I find Dante easier to read than Marx. Again, with all of Marx's texts, really, especially if you're coming at them like blind, if you've never read them before, I would really urge getting some good interpreters, or getting a copy of the Manifesto or of Das Kapital that has good notes in it, that has good academic notes. Otherwise he's very hard work. I mean, really bloody hard work. But you often find that. I mean, I find certainly those that are worth reading. I mean, one of my favorite sort of classical or enshrined writers is Dostoyevsky. Dostoyevsky is very, very, very hard to read, but at the same time very beautiful. I mean, the way he writes is gorgeous. It's not difficult to read because the prose is dense or anything like that, although it is. In fact, it's very beautiful. It's very poetic. It's just that the ideas are so often very profound in Dostoyevsky, very profound. And again, there is a lot of reference to sort of Russian idioms of the time, sort of like Russian cultural touchstones, and you need to kind of understand them in order to get the full significance of what he's talking about. But I find that fascinating about texts, particularly those that are interpreted from other languages. A while back, I actually got several Japanese novels. I got the novel of The Ring. I got the original novel of Vampire Hunter D, and it's really fascinating because even when it's interpreted, when it's translated into English, it's an entirely other form of storytelling from traditions that are completely outside of ours, and as a result, there are certain elements to Japanese fiction that are rather difficult for Western eyes to take. I often find this when I try to introduce friends to Japanese cinema or to anime or stuff like that. They often find it very difficult because a lot of the standards and the prescribed traditions of storytelling in Japanese media and narrative are not the same, or are even antithetical to the way Western traditions have developed. Like in Western traditions, there's this whole emphasis on concision, on show don't tell, on minimizing exposition. That seems to be a thing that is very, very profound in Western fiction. In Japanese fiction, it's exactly the opposite. So you often get in Japanese fiction long screeds, long periods where characters are doing nothing but sitting around and talking. You see it in anime all the time. Have you ever watched Death Note? For example, Death Note is great. I really enjoy Death Note, but it does have that, and whether you consider that to be a problem or whether you just consider that to be a part of the material will determine your enjoyment of it. There is a lot in Death Note of characters just doing internal monologue or dialoguing, where they are just talking about what they're going to do. A lot of the early scenes in Death Note is Light Yagami in his room talking about what he could potentially do. In fact, even the anime is so conscious of this trope that it actually parodies it at various points. It lampoons it, which is kind of interesting. It is kind of interesting. You compare and contrast that with a similar form of storytelling. If you look at the BBC adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, the Benedict Cumberbatch one, which, by the way, I'm no great fan of, but it is a very similar kind of story involving very similar kinds of characters. That does a very similar thing, but rather than having the character standing around talking, it introduces things like visual cues. You have numbers and references and images coming up on screen to metaphorically or visually communicate what the characters are thinking, what is going to happen, rather than having the characters standing around talking about it. But that is part of Japanese oral tradition. If you go back to some of the ancient or classical Japanese myths or oral folk tales, that's what they're like. That's how they work. You have characters standing around talking about how things happen. And that can often be really jarring to a Western eye. A lot of anime does that. Oh my god, a lot of anime does that. And some of it works, some of it really, 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 really doesn't. It can get very, very, to a Western eye, it can get just irritating and boring after a while. It's a case of like, it feels a lot of the time as though they are synthetically padded out by having characters standing around talking about things. There are even entire like series or traditions, entire like franchises of anime and games and manga that are that and nothing else. Like, nothing else. I'd argue, like, the video game and anime series Danganronpa is exactly that. It's nothing else. It is just padding. It's fluff. It's characters standing around talking about stuff that's so easily done away with. It's so easily solvable. I mean, in Danganronpa's case, what you've got is you've got it's basically like it's kind of an anime murder mystery. So characters get bumped off one by one, and then you have a situation where you've got to interpret the evidence that you've found. But it goes on and on and on and on when the problems are very easily solvable, unless the characters are synthetically made, quite frankly, the most brainless people on earth. You know, there's a lot of navel gazing, going over the same stuff over and over and over and over and over again. And part of that is just padding. Part of that is just they're just trying to pad the length of the game or the anime. But a lot of it is also derived from Japanese oral tradition. That's the way narrative traditions have developed there. It is not the same in most English-speaking cultures, or indeed in most Western cultures. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's like if you go to Russian fiction. Russian fiction is really bloody interesting because it tends to be classically very dense. It's classically like big blocks, big paragraphs, but those paragraphs are packed with so much stuff. There's so much. It is really a tradition of ideas. Russian fiction always has a very specific idea of what it wants to do and what it wants to explore, and does it. It doesn't stop, I find, with Russian fiction. Whenever, like, Dostoyevsky is the classic example, but when you pick up a Dostoyevsky like Crime and Punishment, it's a black hole. It just keeps digging. It keeps going, and it's fearless. Russian fiction is often like really cold and fearless, so it will go deep into whatever it's talking about, and it will go to the places that maybe other traditions or other writers wouldn't. Again, Crime and Punishment is a great example of that. I mean, it's an exploration of morality, but it's also a kind of exploration of psychology as well. It's about a killer. It's about a murderer, the murderer, one might say. In fiction, I mean, Raskolnikov is one of the most brilliantly realized killers in all of fiction. He really is. He's so amazing, so human. Because I mean, I've talked about it before. But what I love about Raskolnikov more than anything else is the fact that even he doesn't know what his motivations are. And that, to me, is so... It's more true than when you have a killer who's... like a fictional killer whose motivations are so clarified, or they're very narrow, and they're often in English fiction. It's often Freudian. The motivation is often Freudian. It's because this happened to them when they were young, and that's influenced this, and that's influenced that. I hate it. I hate it so much when killers have a simple motivation, because it's never that simple. There's a really good, actually, may have mentioned it before, but I do enjoy reading about things like serial killers, investigations, that kind of thing. And there's a really good series of interviews, which you can get on YouTube very easily, with none other than Jeffrey Dahmer. And they are with Jeffrey Dahmer and his father, actually, from the prison where he was before he died. And it's fascinating. It's like a fascinating insight, because he's asked the obvious question, which is, do you have any idea of why you did what you did? And unlike many serial killers who will take the opportunity to play around with their interviewer, they will bat them around like a cat with a mouse, quite frankly, because it's one little bit of control they can get. If you've ever seen the interviews with Charles Manson, that's exactly what he does. Here, Jeffrey Dahmer seems to be, it may not be the case, it may just be an elaborate game, but he seems to be quite forthcoming and quite earnest. He basically says, look, I could tell you why I think I did it, or how I felt at the time, but that wouldn't give you anything real. It wouldn't give you anything meaningful, because I can't interpret the workings of my own mind. I'm not in a position to, and I don't know. I can tell you what I was thinking, what I was feeling, but that's all. I still can't tell you why I did what I did, and to provide you with a simple answer would be lying. It would simply be a fiction. And I agree, that's kind of straight from the horse's mouth, but it seems to be a true thing, with something as complex and as aberrant as actively killing another human being, in the way that serial killers do, which is, of course, very specific and very planned and very sort of, it becomes habitual, it becomes routine. Simple answers aren't ever going to cut it. They're never going to cut it. That kind of human psychology is so aberrant, it's so strange, and it's so extreme. It's so incredibly extreme that it requires the acknowledgement of complexity in a way that a lot of people are not prepared to do. That's part of the problem, of course. People want simple answers. They want to blame a simple thing. Oh, well, it's because they had this happen to them when they were a child. Oh, well, it's because they were born with this genetic abnormality or this neurological abnormality. It's never going to be that simple. It is never going to be that simple. People love to narrow it down to psychopathy, for example, and that, I mean, even like a cursory examination of psychology, and I've only got like an A level in psychology. I read up on it because I find it interesting, but my qualifications go no further than A level. And a few minor counselling courses that I've done for my job, but the prevalence of psychopathic tendencies in day-to-day culture really puts the kibosh on that. There are lots of people who qualify as psychopaths or who have psychopathic tendencies just operating in culture. They are not serial killers. The serial killing itself is a really aberrant, strange, bizarre thing. How ritualized it is, what it actually serves, it's a very strange thing. So now narrowing it down to psychopathy just does not work. It just doesn't. It's kind of meaningless. Yes, there is a tendency for serial killers to be psychopaths, but not all psychopaths are serial killers. Not even the majority of them. A lot of psychopaths are surgeons, for example. Surgery is pretty much predominated by psychopaths, and that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. It makes a lot of sense. That removal from humanity, that regarding humanity as an engine, as something to manipulate, kind of serves the purpose of a surgeon rather well, doesn't it? It means you're not going to be hampered by the investment and emotions that someone else would be. In fact, in surgery, I can see it as being a positive boon. Politics, unfortunately, predominated, and business, apparently. Business is a fair arena for psychopaths. But it's I find that whole thing fascinating. I can't even remember what I was originally. Psychopaths in fiction. I was talking about killers in fiction. Yeah, killers in fiction are fascinating because you know, it depends on where you go. Some of them. I mean, one of the ones I've always loved is Steerpike. Steerpike from Gormenghast. As you well know, ladies and gentlemen, Gormenghast is my bag. It really is. When you've got your two prongs of fantasy deriving from those traditions, you've got Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien, and you've got Gormenghast by Mervyn Peake, and they go off in very, very different directions. There's some contention as to whether Gormenghast sort of qualifies classically as a fantasy anyway, other than the incidents that it's set in a fantastical kingdom, that is a kingdom that's imaginary. It doesn't have any of the elements. If you went up to someone on the street, or even to an academic, and said, can you give me like the elements of fantasy fiction, they probably wouldn't give you any of them that are in Gormenghast. They'd say things like, dragons, create magical creatures, wizards, gods, you know, that kind of thing. None of that in Gormenghast. There's nothing abstruse in Gormenghast. There's no magic, there's no destiny at work, there's no fate, there's no gods, there's no demons, there's nothing like that. It's an oddly real secular kingdom that just happens to be imaginary. The only thing beyond that, the only thing that really betrays its fantastical nature is how heightened the characters are. The fact that they kind of embody archetypes and ideas. And one of obviously one of fiction's greatest, I suppose, not only most successful, quote unquote, killers in terms of body count, but in terms of complexity of motivation, is Steerpike. Steerpike is a fascinating creature. On almost every level, he is really, really interesting. The revolutionary killer, the political killer in many respects, but also not that simple. Were it as simple as him killing through necessity for function, then he wouldn't be half as interesting. He enjoys it. There is a sadistic, grandiose streak in Steerpike that is... Part of it is performative, part of it is theatrical. He's trying to make a point to change the nature of Gormenghast, or even just to express his disgust for it, his disdain for the way it works. And also just to prove his own superiority. Like a lot of killers in fiction, a bit like Light Yagami, actually, who we referred to earlier, he's undone by his hubris. Steerpike could have won. Steerpike could have gotten away with it. You know what his big mistake was? His biggest mistake. It's when he kills Barkentine. It's when he kills Barkentine and he takes the time to gloat. He shouldn't have done that. He should have just killed him. He should have just killed him there and then, easily, quickly, got it done with. But he doesn't, and that is his undoing, really. That is his undoing. If he hadn't have done that, he'd have won. He'd have climbed to the very heights of Gormenghast, and he'd have toppled it. Brick by brick, from the top down, he'd have kicked it down like a sadistic child destroying an anthill. Because that's what he wants. That's what he wants. His contempt for Gormenghast, for what it does, for the fact that he was born to the kitchens and yet was condemned to the kitchens and yet is more brilliant than any of them. Those that are born to luxury, those that are born to power and influence. That's something I love about Steer Pike. He is a revolutionary killer, and there is something very attractive about him, and yet at the same time he is also an out-and-out monster. Kind of love that. I mean, one of the more culturally prevalent at the moment is Hannibal, obviously, simply because of how absolutely stunning the TV series, the Mads Mikkelsen series of Hannibal is. Now, in the books, Hannibal is kind of dull. I'll be honest. He's interesting in the first two, when he is an inexplicable element, when he's basically like Mephistopheles, when he's a strangely demonic figure dropped into a very psychologically and culturally real world. Then he's interesting. The third book is awful. Hannibal, the book, is absolutely atrocious for many reasons, but the big reason is that it does exactly what I talked about earlier, where it just gives him this very narrow Freudian motivation for doing what he does. He eats people because his sister Misha was cannibalized. That's it. That's it. That's all the book draws, and it's kind of like, that's really boring. That actually reduces the character so powerfully, and it just makes him kind of dull, I'll be honest. In the TV series and the films, actually, the films did beautifully avoid that, apart from Hannibal Rising, but we won't talk about that because that doesn't exist. That was a just atrocious piece of work. The series manages to avoid that by implying but not stating. We know in the series that his sister Misha was cannibalized, but we don't know what the significance of that is. The series very deftly weaves around it without stating absolutely, yes, this is why Hannibal does what he does. It's very, very clever in that regard. It's very clever. In order for Hannibal to work, he needs to remain aloof. He needs to remain this bizarrely unmotivated creature. What makes Hannibal interesting in the TV series is that he's an entity of pure appetite and aesthetics, he is all about a strange and macabre kind of beauty. And he sees beauty in many, 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 many things, from beautiful food and exquisite art and music to the efforts of various different sadists and serial killers and whatnot. He doesn't differentiate. That's the interesting thing about Hannibal. He doesn't differentiate. He's weaving stories all the time. His entire life is mythological. And that's how he weighs his experience with Will. With the brilliantly redrawn version of Will that you find, of Will Graham, that you find in the Hannibal TV series, works so well. It works so well because, of course, it introduces that intimacy between them, which is queer and wonderful. And I mean, I hesitate to even call it homosexual. It's way beyond that. It's something else. It operates on some other level. It's homoerotic and homoromantic. That's definitely the case. But it's something else as well. It's something that is operating on an entirely other level of definition, and I kind of love that. Anywho, thank you so much for listening to me ramble on in this video, and it was a bloody ramble, wasn't it? There's a lot going on in that one. I may pick up some of these threads to produce more fulsome episodes or discussions later on. But until next time, my loves, bye-bye!